Ethan Caldwell was a man who had everything: money, power, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. Born into a wealthy family, he never had to work for anything. Whatever he wanted, he got. Expensive cars, private jets, luxury vacations. His life was a series of extravagant experiences. But there was one problem. Ethan had never learned the value of respect. He believed that money could buy everything, even people's dignity. On a bright summer afternoon, Ethan arrived in London with his group of friends. It was not his first time visiting, but this time, he was there for pure fun. He booked an entire floor of a 5-star hotel, ordered the most expensive champagne, and planned to make this trip unforgettable. He wasn't interested in the history or beauty of London. For him, it was just another place to show off his wealth and have a good time. That evening, as they walked through the city, they came across Buckingham Palace. A large crowd had gathered, taking pictures of the famous royal guards who stood perfectly still, dressed in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Ethan had seen them before, but never really paid attention. Now, watching them up close, he felt a strange mix of amusement and curiosity. "These guys don't even blink," one of his friends chuckled. "They look like statues," another added. Ethan smirked. "I bet I can make one of them move." His friends laughed, but Ethan was serious. He loved challenges, especially ones that involved making fun of others. For him, it was all about entertainment. His friends, always eager to see what he would do next, encouraged him. "All right," Ethan said, pulling out his wallet. "I'll make a bet. Whoever can make a guard break character wins £10,000. His friends' eyes widened. They knew Ethan was reckless, but this was a bold challenge. The royal guards were known for their discipline. No matter what people did, they never reacted. Ethan stepped forward confidently. He stood inches away from one of the guards and started making silly faces. He waved his hands, jumped up and down, and even pretended to fall right in front of him. The guard didn't move an inch. The crowd around them watched with mixed reactions. Some laughed, while others looked uncomfortable. Ethan's friends cheered him on. "Come on, Ethan. You can do better than that." Annoyed that his tricks weren't working, Ethan tried speaking directly to the guard. "Hey, mate, how long can you stand like this? Don't you ever get tired?" Silence. Ethan clicked his fingers in front of the guard's face. Nothing. The guard remained still, eyes straight ahead, completely ignoring him. Frustration started to build inside Ethan. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, people listened when he spoke. People reacted when he did something. But this guard, he was acting as if Ethan didn't even exist. Suddenly, Ethan spotted something nearby. A street artist selling paintings. Next to the artist was a bucket of red paint. A mischievous idea crossed his mind. If silly faces and jokes couldn't make the guard move, maybe a little shock would. Without thinking twice, Ethan walked over, grabbed the bucket of paint, and turned back toward the guard. His friends, realizing what he was about to do, started laughing. They assumed it was just another one of Ethan's jokes. With a smirk on his face, Ethan lifted the bucket and, in one swift motion, poured the paint all over the guard's uniform. For a brief moment, there was silence. The bright red liquid dripped down the guard's pristine uniform, soaking into the fabric. The crowd gasped in horror. Some people pulled out their phones to record what had just happened. Ethan stood there, expecting a reaction. He thought the guard would finally break his stillness. Maybe shout, maybe push him away, maybe even chase him. But the guard didn't move. He remained in position, his expression unchanged, as the red paint continued to stain his clothes. Ethan's friends burst into laughter, clapping and cheering. "You actually did it. That was insane," one of them shouted. But Ethan barely heard them. A strange feeling crept into his chest. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. The guard wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't fighting back. He was just standing there. Then, before Ethan could fully process what was happening, a group of security officers rushed forward. Within seconds, Ethan felt a firm grip on his arm. A deep voice spoke behind him. "Sir, you need to come with us." Now, Ethan's smile vanished. The laughter of his friends faded. He turned around and saw several uniformed officers surrounding him. The crowd, once amused, now watched with serious faces. Phones continued recording. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Ethan could feel his heart pounding as the officers tightened their grip on his arms. The laughter of his friends had completely stopped now. They stepped back, their faces filled with shock. No one had expected the situation to turn serious so quickly. Just moments ago, it had all seemed like a harmless joke to them. A silly prank, nothing more. But now, as security surrounded Ethan, it was clear that this was no joke. "Sir, step aside," one of the officers instructed firmly. His voice was calm but strict, leaving no room for argument. Ethan's mouth opened to protest, but before he could speak, one of the officers took hold of his wrist and pulled it behind his back. The reality of the moment hit him like a cold wave. People in the crowd gasped. Some whispered to each other, while others continued recording the scene. "This is ridiculous," Ethan muttered. It was just a joke. But the officer didn't loosen his grip. Instead, he looked straight into Ethan's eyes and spoke in a low, serious tone. "You just defaced royal property. Do you understand what you've done?" Ethan blinked. Royal property. He hadn't thought about that. He had only been trying to get a reaction out of the guard. He had never considered the deeper meaning of what he had just done. It was only paint. It would wash off, wouldn't it? His friends hesitated, unsure of what to do. One of them finally stepped forward, laughing nervously. "Come on, officer. It was just a little fun. We'll pay for the cleaning, all right." The officer didn't respond to him. Instead, he nodded toward the other security personnel, and within seconds, Ethan was being led away. "Hey, wait." Ethan struggled. "You can't just take me like this. I'll pay whatever fine there is." The officer ignored him and kept walking. The crowd parted as Ethan was taken through, their eyes filled with judgment. Some people shook their heads. Others muttered about how disrespectful the act had been. The videos kept rolling. Every single moment was being captured. His arrest, his protests, his confused expression. As Ethan was taken toward a waiting police vehicle, he caught one last glimpse of the royal guard he had poured paint on. The man still stood in his position, completely still, his face emotionless. The bright red paint dripped from his uniform, staining the ground below him. He hadn't moved an inch. That image stayed in Ethan's mind as he was pushed into the vehicle. Inside, the air felt thick. Ethan tried to calm himself, but his frustration grew with each passing second. "This is insane," he mumbled to himself. He had gotten away with much worse things in the past. Why was this different? He was Ethan Caldwell. His money always fixed things. He pulled out his phone, but before he could dial a number, one of the officers took it away. "You'll get this back later," the officer said. Ethan clenched his fists. He was starting to feel trapped. After what felt like forever, the vehicle stopped in front of a police station. Ethan was taken inside, past desks and officers who barely looked at him. Finally, he was seated in a small, cold room. A stern-looking officer sat across from him, a file in hand. "Ethan Caldwell," the officer said, flipping through some papers. 32 years old, businessman, frequent traveler, no prior arrests. Ethan sat up straighter, hoping his clean record would work in his favor. "Exactly. So let's just talk this out. It was a mistake, all right. I didn't mean any harm." The officer looked at him, unimpressed. "Mr. Caldwell, do you understand that you just committed a serious offense? Vandalizing a Royal Guard's uniform is not a minor act. That uniform represents the honor and discipline of this country. It is not just clothing. It is a symbol." Ethan scoffed. "It's just paint. It's not like I hurt anyone. The officer sighed and placed a piece of paper on the table in front of Ethan. Do you know how many people have been arrested for disrespecting a royal guard in the past? Very few. You're about to join a very exclusive list. Ethan swallowed. This was not going the way he had expected. We will be pressing charges, the officer continued. You will remain here for questioning. Your lawyer will be allowed to see you soon. Ethan's head spun. Pressing charges. This was really happening. As the officer stood up to leave, Ethan felt a wave of regret. He had only wanted to have a little fun, to impress his friends, to win a stupid bet. But now he was sitting in a police station, facing legal trouble in a foreign country. And worst of all, his actions had been caught on camera. He had no idea yet, but the entire world was already watching his downfall unfold. Ethan sat in the cold, dimly lit room, tapping his fingers on the table. He had been waiting for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been about 30 minutes. His mind raced. This was supposed to be a fun trip, just another adventure where he could do whatever he wanted. He never imagined he would end up in a police station. The door opened, and a new officer walked in, holding a file. He sat down across from Ethan and studied him for a moment before speaking. Mr. Caldwell, do you understand the seriousness of your actions? Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, I already told the other officer. It was a joke. I didn't mean anything by it. The officer didn't react. He simply opened the file and pulled out a few papers. We have multiple video recordings of the incident. Do you know how quickly this spread online? He slid a tablet across the table, showing a news website. Ethan's face was on the front page, right under a bold headline. Wealthy tourist disrespects Royal Guard in disgusting act. Ethan's stomach tightened as he scrolled through the article. Thousands of people had commented, calling him arrogant, disrespectful, and spoiled. Some were demanding serious punishment. Others were comparing him to past tourists who had faced consequences for disrespecting local culture. The officer leaned forward. This isn't just about paint, Mr. Caldwell. You embarrassed a symbol of this country. You humiliated a guard who was only doing his duty. The world is watching, and they are not impressed. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had faced bad publicity before, but this was different. This was not just a scandal that would disappear in a few weeks. This was international news. Just then, the door opened again, and his lawyer, Mr. Anderson, stepped inside. A tall, sharp-looking man in a dark suit, he carried an air of authority. Ethan felt a sense of relief. If anyone could fix this mess, it was him. The officer nodded and left the room, allowing Ethan to speak privately with his lawyer. Mr. Anderson placed his briefcase on the table and sat down. Ethan, what were you thinking? His tone was calm, but there was clear disappointment in his eyes. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I didn't think it would be a big deal. It was just a prank. Mr. Anderson shook his head. Well, it is a big deal. You're being charged with vandalism and public disorder. The authorities are not taking this lightly. And with the way the media is covering this, the courts might want to make an example out of you. Ethan's heart pounded. An example? What does that mean? Mr. Anderson sighed. It means they could give you the harshest punishment possible to show that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Ethan swallowed hard. So, what do we do? I'll do my best to negotiate, Mr. Anderson said. But I need you to understand something. You can't just throw money at this problem. The court doesn't care how rich you are. And the public, they're waiting to see you fall. Ethan had never felt so powerless before. He had always believed that money and influence could fix anything. But now, he was realizing that there were things even his wealth couldn't control. Mr. Anderson glanced at his watch. You'll stay in custody until your hearing tomorrow. We'll see what the judge says. Until then, do not say anything to the media. Don't make things worse for yourself. Ethan nodded numbly. His head was spinning. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, above the rules that ordinary people had to follow. But now, for the first time, he felt trapped. As Mr. Anderson left the room, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His phone was gone. His freedom was gone. And outside, the world was watching his every move. The fun, exciting trip he had planned was now turning into the biggest mistake of his life. Ethan sat on the hard bench inside the holding cell, staring at the gray walls. The cold air made him shiver, but it wasn't just the temperature that sent chills down his spine. It was the realization that for the first time in his life, he was truly stuck. No luxury hotel, no expensive car, no private jet, just a small cell with a metal bench and a locked door. He still couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. Just yesterday, he had been laughing with his friends, drinking champagne in a 5-star suite. Now he was wearing the same clothes from the day before. His expensive watch had been taken away, and he had no idea what would happen next. A loud buzzer sounded, breaking his thoughts. The heavy door creaked open, and a guard stepped inside. "You have a visitor," the man said, his voice firm. Ethan stood up quickly, hoping to see his lawyer again. But when he stepped into the meeting room, he was surprised to see a familiar face, his father. Richard Caldwell was a powerful businessman, known for his sharp mind and strict discipline. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he expected his son to follow in his footsteps. He had always warned Ethan about reckless behavior, but Ethan had never listened. Now, standing in front of him, Ethan could see the disappointment in his father's eyes. "What have you done, Ethan?" his father asked, his voice calm but heavy. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, it's not as bad as it looks. It was just a prank." His father's expression remained cold. "A prank? Do you realize how serious this is? The whole world is watching you. Your name, our family name, is being dragged through the mud because of your foolish actions." Ethan swallowed hard. He had never seen his father this angry before. "I've spoken with your lawyer," his father continued. "You're facing real charges. This isn't something that can be fixed with money, Ethan. You embarrassed an entire country. You disrespected a symbol of honor. This isn't just about you anymore." Ethan looked down at the table. He knew his father was right, but he didn't know what to say. Richard Caldwell sighed, rubbing his temples. "I warned you, Ethan. I told you that one day your arrogance would cost you, but you never listened." Ethan clenched his fists. He hated feeling like a child being scolded. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Dad. You just acted without thinking." Like always, his father shook his head. "This is your mess, Ethan. And this time, you have to clean it up." Ethan's heart sank. "What does that mean?" His father's eyes were firm. "I'm not bailing you out. I won't use my influence to make this go away. You're going to face the consequences of your actions. Maybe then, you'll finally learn something." Ethan's mouth went dry. He had always relied on his father's power to fix things. But now, for the first time, he was truly on his own. Richard Caldwell stood up. "Your hearing is tomorrow. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're going to say." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. As the door closed behind his father, reality hit him harder than ever. This wasn't just a bad situation anymore. This was the biggest mistake of his life. Ethan lay awake on the hard bench, staring at the ceiling of his holding cell. The hours felt endless. His mind kept replaying his father's words. "You're going to face the consequences of your actions." He had never been in a situation where money and power couldn't save him. Growing up in a wealthy family, Ethan had always believed problems could be solved with influence. If he made a mistake, there was always someone to clean it up. But this time, his father had walked away. And now, for the first time, he was truly alone. A loud noise broke his thoughts as the heavy cell door opened. A guard stepped inside. "Caldwell, time to go." Ethan sat up quickly. "Where?" "Court hearing." The guard replied. "Get up." Ethan's stomach twisted as he stood. He had spent all night thinking about what he would say, but he still wasn't sure how things would go. His lawyer had told him to remain calm, to show regret, to apologize if needed. But would that be enough? He was led out of the station, past flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions. The media was everywhere. The moment he stepped into the police car, he realized how big this had become. The ride to the courthouse felt too short. Before he knew it, he was stepping into a courtroom filled with reporters, officials, and strangers who had all come to witness his fate. His lawyer, Mr. Anderson, stood by his side, his face unreadable. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never felt so small. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, looked at him from her seat. She tapped a few papers on her desk before speaking. "Mr. Ethan Caldwell, you are charged with public disorder and vandalism of royal property. How do you plead?" Ethan opened his mouth, but his throat felt dry. His lawyer gave him a small nod, reminding him of what they had discussed. "Guilty, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice quieter than he expected. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Ethan felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong. The judge continued, "Mr. Caldwell, you are a visitor in this country. You showed great disrespect to a royal guard, a man who stood silently, serving his duty. You humiliated him for entertainment." Ethan lowered his eyes. He had never thought about it that way. He had been so focused on himself, on impressing his friends, that he hadn't considered the guard's feelings at all. The judge's voice remained firm. "Your actions were seen worldwide. Many believe that, as a man of wealth, you assumed you could behave as you pleased without consequences. This court must ensure that such behavior is not repeated." Ethan's heart pounded. What was his punishment going to be? A fine? Community service? Then the judge continued, "In addition to a fine, you will perform 100 hours of community service. However, this is not an ordinary punishment. You will spend your service learning about discipline and respect." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" The judge glanced at a document before looking back at him. "You will spend the next month under the supervision of the Royal Guard training program." Ethan's breath caught. Training? What kind of training? The judge's expression remained serious. "You will live as a recruit. You will wake up early, follow orders, and understand what it means to serve with honor. Perhaps then you will learn the value of respect." Ethan's mind reeled. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a lesson. For the first time in his life, he wouldn't be the one giving orders. He would be the one following them, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan stood outside the Royal Guard Training Center, staring at the tall gates in front of him. He still couldn't believe this was happening. Just a week ago, he had been living in luxury, doing whatever he wanted. Now he was about to start training like a soldier. A stern-looking officer approached him. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight. "Ethan Caldwell?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I'm Captain Harris. For the next month, you will follow every rule, every order, and every command. You are no longer a privileged tourist. You are a trainee, just like everyone else here. Is that understood?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this. "Yeah, I guess." Captain Harris's eyes narrowed. "You guess. The correct response is yes, sir." Ethan blinked. "Yes, sir," he said, feeling strange. Captain Harris turned and started walking. "Follow me." Ethan sighed and did as he was told. The training center was a large compound, with rows of simple dormitories, an open training field, and several guards practicing drills. He could already tell this was going to be much harder than he expected. As they entered a small building, Captain Harris handed Ethan a folded uniform. "You will wear this. No designer clothes, no expensive watches, no special treatment. You wake up at 5 a.m. sharp. You eat what everyone else eats. You train like everyone else trains. If you don't follow the rules, you will face extra discipline. Ethan stared at the uniform in his hands. It was plain, stiff, and completely different from the high-end clothes he was used to. He swallowed hard. What exactly will I be doing here? Captain Harris gave him a firm look. You will learn respect, responsibility, and discipline. And by the time you leave, you will understand what it means to serve something greater than yourself. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He wanted to argue, to say that this was all a mistake. But deep down, he knew he had no choice. The first day of training was worse than he expected. At exactly 5 a.m., a loud whistle echoed through the dormitory. Ethan groaned as he sat up. He had barely slept on the stiff mattress. His whole body ached. But when he tried to take his time getting up, a loud voice shouted, "Movie!" Outside, in 2 minutes. Still half asleep, Ethan rushed to change into his uniform and ran outside, where a group of trainees was already lined up. Today's training will test your patience, strength, and discipline, Captain Harris announced. You will march, exercise, and complete tasks without question. Ethan rolled his eyes. How hard could it be? But after just an hour, he realized how wrong he was. The training was brutal. Running with weights, holding difficult positions, practicing drills over and over. Ethan had never pushed his body this hard before. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His legs burned, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. By midday, he was completely exhausted. His hands were covered in dirt, his uniform soaked in sweat. He had never felt so out of place in his life. But the hardest part wasn't the physical training. It was the discipline. Ethan had always been able to talk back, to complain, to do things his way. But here, every complaint was met with more training. Every mistake meant extra exercises. If he argued, he had to do more push-ups. If he showed disrespect, he had to run an extra lap. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't the one in control. That night, as he collapsed onto his bed, his body aching in ways he had never felt before, he finally understood one thing. This was going to be the hardest challenge of his life. And there was no way out. Ethan woke up before the whistle blew. It had been over a week since his training started, and his body was finally adjusting. The first few days had been miserable. Every muscle ached. Every task felt impossible. But now, something was changing. For the first time in his life, he was learning to push through discomfort. As the whistle rang across the dormitory, Ethan quickly sat up, dressed in his uniform, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, and the other trainees stood in a straight line, waiting for instructions. He took his place among them, no longer feeling out of place. Captain Harris walked down the row, inspecting each trainee. When he stopped in front of Ethan, he gave him a sharp look. "You're improving, Caldwell," he said, "but don't get too comfortable. There's still a long way to go." Ethan didn't respond with his usual smirk or attitude. Instead, he nodded. "Yes, sir." The day's training was intense, as always. Drills, running, strength exercises. It never got easier. But Ethan had stopped complaining. He had stopped looking for ways to avoid the hard work. Instead, he focused on finishing each task. During the afternoon drills, Ethan noticed something that surprised him. One of the other trainees, Daniel, was struggling. He was sweating heavily, his steps unsteady. Before, Ethan wouldn't have cared, but something inside him had changed. As Daniel nearly tripped during a run, Ethan grabbed his arm and steadied him. "Come on," he said. "Just a little more." Daniel looked at him in surprise. Ethan had been the least serious person in the group at first, but now he was offering help. Together, they finished the run. That evening, as they sat in the dining hall, Daniel nudged Ethan. "Didn't think you were the type to help someone," he said with a small grin. Ethan smirked but shrugged. "Didn't think I was either." Daniel laughed. "Well, thanks." Ethan didn't respond, but deep down, he felt something new, something better than the rush of spending money or showing off. For the first time, He felt real respect. Not the kind that came from being rich, but the kind that came from working hard and helping others. As the days passed, Ethan kept improving. He learned to follow orders without complaint. He learned to respect the discipline of the guards. He even started to admire them. One evening, Captain Harris approached him. "Caldwell, walk with me." Ethan followed, wondering what this was about. "You've changed," Captain Harris said. "When you first came here, you were arrogant and careless. Now, you're different." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I guess I just never knew what real discipline looked like before." Captain Harris looked at him closely. "And what do you think now?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I think I was wrong about a lot of things." Captain Harris gave him a small nod of approval. "Good, because tomorrow you'll face your final test, and if you pass, you'll have earned something far more valuable than money." Ethan didn't ask what the test was. He just nodded. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of hard work. Ethan stood in line with the other trainees, his heart pounding in his chest. Today was the final test, the moment that would determine if he had truly learned anything from his time here. Captain Harris paced in front of them, his sharp eyes scanning the group. "You have all trained hard. Some of you have struggled, but you kept going. Today, you will prove that you understand what it means to serve with discipline and respect." Ethan took a deep breath. He had been through tough drills, exhausting training, and harsh discipline. But this was different. The test was designed to push them to their limits, physically and mentally. It would include endurance, teamwork, and most importantly, discipline under pressure. The first part of the test was a long-distance run through the forest with heavy gear. Ethan had always hated running, but this time, he pushed through. He didn't complain. He didn't try to find a shortcut. He ran. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. When he finally reached the finish line, he saw Daniel, his fellow trainee, struggling behind him. Without thinking, Ethan ran back and helped him forward. "Come on," he said, gripping Daniel's arm. With one final effort, they'd both crossed the line together. Captain Harris nodded approvingly but didn't say anything. The test wasn't over. Next, they had to complete a difficult obstacle course, climbing walls, crawling under barbed wire, carrying heavy objects. It was brutal, but Ethan no longer saw it as a punishment. He saw it as a challenge. Every time he wanted to stop, he remembered why he was here. He had embarrassed a royal guard. He had disrespected an honorable institution. But now he was proving to himself and to everyone else that he had changed. Finally, the last part of the test arrived. It wasn't physical. It was a test of discipline. Each trainee had to stand completely still, just like the royal guards they had once mocked. They had to maintain perfect posture, no matter what happened around them. Ethan stood tall, his face calm, his body still. Tourists walked past, whispering, taking pictures, even laughing. Some tried to distract him, but Ethan didn't move. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be in the guard's position. The patience, the discipline, the respect it required. After what felt like hours, Captain Harris called the test to an end. Ethan exhaled, his muscles aching, but he didn't complain. Captain Harris stepped forward. "Caldwell, step out." Ethan did as he was told. He stood straight, waiting. "You came here arrogant, careless, and disrespectful," Captain Harris said. "But today, you showed strength, discipline, and responsibility. You could have finished the race alone, but you helped a teammate. You could have given up, but you pushed through. You could have laughed at this final test, but you stood with honor." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "You have completed your training," Captain Harris continued, "and you have earned my respect." For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't need expensive clothes, a fancy car, or a famous last name to feel important. He had earned something far more valuable: respect, discipline, and a true understanding of honor. As he left the training center, He glanced back one last time. This place had changed him, and he would never be the same again.